Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to this national webinar, Designing the Canada Water Agency for Successful Co-Development and Collaboration with Indigenous Peoples. My name is Stephanie Merrill, and I'm a Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Global Water Futures Program, and I'm based at the University of Saskatchewan. Today's event, outlined here, is being convened by the Global Water Futures Program and is a continuation of our work through the Water Security for Canadians initiative, which is a partnership that includes the Forum for Leadership on Water, the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance at the University of Victoria, the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources, the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment and Health, Massey College, and Aqua Forum. We're going to speak a little bit more to Global Water Futures in more detail. However, I'll just say a few introductory words. Global Water Futures is the world's largest university-led water research program. It's a partnership between the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Waterloo, McMaster University, and Wilfrid Laurier University. We're at the halfway mark of a 7-year program to advance the science needed to better forecast, prepare for, and manage water futures in the face of dramatically increasing risks from climate change. Working with water practitioners in governments, industries, and community organizations guides us and enables us to better connect our science and our evidence into water programs, decisions, and policy developments. Global Water Futures supports co-led research projects on water issues affecting Indigenous people across the country with the goal of supporting water decolonization in Canada. Improving water management in Canada is fundamentally the aim of this program. And the opportunity to design a Canada Water Agency that fosters successful collaboration with Indigenous peoples is critical to modernizing water management and governance and ensuring water security for all and for future generations. Today's webinar is meant to build on the discussions of the National Water Policy Panel hosted in mid-May, and then other workshops on agricultural considerations for the agency in June, both of which are archived on the Global Water Futures website. A couple of quick logistics. The webinar will be 2 hours long. Participants will remain muted to ensure clear audio. And if you haven't found it already, you are able to listen to this in French by clicking the interpretation button in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen and choosing French language. We are recording in both languages and we will share after the event. Feel free to use the chat box in order to generate some discussion amongst the group, but we please ask that you use the dedicated Q&A function to submit your questions that we will draw upon to pose to our guests today. So I want to officially begin by acknowledging that we're all participating today from traditional territories across this country of many First Peoples nations. I'm in Saskatoon on Treaty 6, traditional territory of the Cree and homeland of the Métis. I'm pleased to introduce Elder Roland Duquette, originally from Mistawassis, a Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan who now lives in Saskatoon. Thank you, Elder Duquette, for joining us today, and I'll turn it to you to do an opening of our discussions.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Pitama kakyo gatam skatna o no skagik sepaya. Wotanisna and taskina hipi witapmia. Iwi tihia ka oman pi kamam skutami sim stageti. Tansimina kaitapata kaya kawani tigia kaya kapistupoyak mina. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Treaty 6 territory, our homeland, and where we had lived for thousands of years. That we worked with the land, the waters, everything that was put on here by Creator, Mother Earth, looking after us, in the sense of, I guess, respecting the water, because that's where we came from. We were with the water when we were in our mother's womb. Always maintained that fact. And once we start addressing the issues of water, we're, if it's abused, then we're abusing our woman. We're, we can't get away from that way of a moral teaching. It's how we adapt to that way of knowing what we have to respect. If we start abusing water, we start abusing the land as well. And then, especially, I noticed the other day we were driving to somewhere, and I noticed this plane was, flying overhead, and he was spraying, I don't know, some chemical, and it was a little bit windy, and then you could literally see that, chemical, being taken away by the wind. So even that, I don't know if there's any regulation that regulates that, because we're harming the land, the waters, where it lands, So anyway, that was my concern that day, and it really disturbed me. But today now, with everybody, on board, how to address these issues, address the, the need, the protection of the water, that is a big thing, And then that's where I try to find myself to know that I'm still available to, talk about that, And actually in New Zealand, they put the water in the human rights, that is alive, and it should be the same protection that we should have here in Canada. That is one of the things that, could be implemented in, sort of global thing, because it's a global, issue, So that's my concern for that. It's something that I have a need to maybe voice that out, and helping out, our children, our grandchildren, So we have to be very diligent and be sensitive to those things, But I want to welcome everybody that's online from wherever you come from. Your travels will be good when you leave, and your thoughts of what you're going to be discussing will be open, and then we will know that what we say is from the heart. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll be back in a little while here later to join you back again, and enjoy your meeting and discussion, because that's what we need, is more to bring out what we feel and what we think. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elder Duquette. Thank you so much for opening our discussions in a good way today. I also just want to recognize that today is also a part of a 2-day scholar strike in Canada, where university professionals are being encouraged to pause their teaching and administrative duties to organize and attend digital teach-ins to raise awareness on police brutality and violence and racial justice for anti-Black violence and anti-Indigenous colonial violence. So I wanted to thank and welcome researchers and students who have joined us here today to hear from Indigenous voices and to learn more about working with Indigenous communities. So we're going to begin with 2 presentations by Global Water Futures, and I'll ask John to queue up your slide deck. We're going to have Dr. John Pomeroy and Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill, and I'll introduce both of you now, and then we can transition into the presentations. So Dr. John Pomeroy is the Canada Research Chair in Water Resources and Climate Change, and is a distinguished professor at the University of Saskatchewan, where he directs the Global Water Futures program. His research focuses on developing better understanding prediction, and management of water in cold regions around the world. Dr. John Martin Hill is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University. Her research focuses on Indigenous knowledge and cultural conservation, Indigenous women, traditional medicine, and health, and the contemporary practices of Indigenous traditionalism. She leads Global Water Futures supported research projects co-led with Indigenous communities. She's Mohawk of the Wolf Clan and resides at 6 Nations of the Grand River. So John, is your slide share working okay?
Yeah, we're ready to go. So
great.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Elder Duquette for providing a very relevant and poignant introduction to the meeting. I wanted to spend a few minutes as we get started here to talk about the Global Water Futures program and the water crisis that Canada is in, which has great relevance for Indigenous peoples across the country, and then how the Canada Water Agency ties in to these aspects. And so I'll do that very quickly as a way of setting the context as we move into Professor Martin Hill's presentation and then the interview and panel discussion. So I mean, fundamentally why we're here is that water is the basis for life and controls all of human activity. It also regulates our global climate system, and we're in trouble. We have a climate crisis occurring right now. Those of you who live in far western Canada may have your skies obscured and your air polluted by smoke from the vast forest fires that are burning to the south of us in the western US and in parts of BC and Alberta in recent times. But we've all seen these fires over the last few years. We've seen the droughts. Many of our communities have been affected by recent floods, and I think every single person has had to deal with declining water quality over time, whether it's boil water advisories or a lake that's no longer suitable for drinking from, or a collapse of aquatic ecosystems that rely upon these. And these were sort of our own goals. We've done this to ourselves over the last century, but a lot of it has been in pursuit of industrial development, energy, and food security. But we paid the price by destroying our water system to the point where we are in a global water crisis of contaminated water supplies, increasing floods and droughts, and this actually threatens our very existence over time. So this is a serious problem. In Canada, we often think of ourselves as a water fortunate country. We have more fresh water per person than any other large country in terms of our stores and flows. But if you zoom in around the country and take a look at various issues occurring, we see that, no, we have a water crisis in Canada, and it's very severe. Whether it's in the north, where we have permafrost causing washouts and degrading the infrastructure of our communities, to melting glaciers in the Yukon causing drops in lakes like Kluane Lake, to floods out of the Rocky Mountains, to the flows from the oil sand development north along the Athabasca, associated also not only with contamination, but now with flooding, and of course the fires at Fort McMurray. So this area in northern Alberta is a hotbed of multiple disasters. To prairie floods and droughts, the floods which often transport contaminants into large water bodies such as Lake Winnipeg, which then feed algal blooms for large periods of time. And you can say the same about Lake Erie in a wet year. To issues with groundwater contamination and apportionment, inability to regulate things such as substantial groundwater outflows near First Nations, such as down by 6 Nations. The Ring of Fire mining protests over land and water rights that remain unresolved in northwestern Ontario. Mercury contamination at Grassy Narrows, So some of these are very long-standing problems, and they're unacceptable. This is not the Canada we want to be, and this is not the Canada we should be. And so Global Water Futures and perhaps this Canada Water Agency, there's a nice list of things to start addressing here. When we start to put all this together, we can say, yes, all right, Canada has lots of water, but we're still not water secure. And we recognize the tremendous reliance of the Canadian economy on water through various sectors, but also the tremendous costs from extreme events associated with water on the Canadian economy. And the $28 billion figure, you can up that several $billion to get up to 2020. Then remembering that climate change is enhanced in Canada. We're warming at twice the global rate, and Northern Canada is warming at 3 times the global rate. And so we're already seeing climate change that exceeds the 2 degrees Celsius safe threshold. It's already occurred in parts of Canada. We're already unsafe and seeing these rapid changes. So this is the background that means we cannot carry on as we have been. Obviously, we have to get climate change under control. We have to develop better development, but we have to manage our water in the meantime much better, and we need to do this right away. So in 2016, the federal government's Canada First Research Excellence Fund funded the proposal for the Global Water Futures Program. This was from a consortium of universities headed by the University of Saskatchewan, but with Waterloo, McMaster, and Laurier, and many others you see listed there. And they granted it the largest grant for water research by universities in the world. And we have taken it very seriously and tried to build an excellent and relevant program with that grant funding. There are 2 primary aims for the Global Water Futures Program. One is to place Canada as a global leader in water science for cold regions where snow ice, permafrost, lake ice, other forms of frozen winter play an important role. This is where Canada can and should lead, and I think we're getting back into that role. Now, the other is to address strategic needs for the Canadian economy in adapting to climate change and managing the risks from very uncertain water futures and these extreme events that I've mentioned. The mission, really 3-part. We have inadequate disaster warning in Canada. We could have more days of warning. We could be foreseeing these events in the future, and that would help us to plan and to mitigate these risks, to plan evacuations better, to avoid circumstances in many cases. We need to predict the water that we will have in the future. What will be, where will it be, what quality will it be, how might we manage it later in this century? And we have communities, industry, governments, others that need to adapt to changing water circumstances and manage risks better. And so these are all things that Global Water Futures can help. To do this, we've assembled a massive program. It's involving over 200 academics from more than 20 universities across Canada now. And the program has hired roughly almost 1,000 graduate students, researchers, other students, scientists, technicians working on the program. So it's a 1,200-person program crossing the country with a substantial presence in Indigenous communities, as I will outline. Early on, we developed an Indigenous community water research strategy for the program. And in fact, our very first meeting in Canada was co-hosted and partly held at Six Nations in Ontario. And so started with a water security and climate change symposium that then moved into the full Global Water Futures meeting. And we're eternally grateful to Six Nations for hosting this. But it's more than that. We've had regional workshops dealing with Indigenous water issues. The projects and our core teams, we have 51 projects and 6 core teams are mandated to engage with Indigenous communities and then direct engagement with Indigenous nations governments. We also have a number of specific projects out of the 51 that deal with Indigenous community water research. And I'll mention a few of them here. The 6 you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen are co-led projects, co-led between universities and the Indigenous communities. And these run from Southern Ontario up into Northwestern Canada and in between. Dealing with water quality issues, health issues, flooding and sediment issues, fish issues, and also to co-create mixed method technologies using Indigenous knowledge. We also have a project, one of the large ones created early on was co-creation of Indigenous water quality issues that's really based at McMaster University and Six Nations in Ontario. And this deals with using Indigenous knowledge and electrical engineering and chemical engineering to create water quality tools that can help communities better measure and maintain their health with water. And Dawn Martin-Hill will speak to that in particular, along with the OHNEGANOS project in a bit. We also have other projects that have substantial Indigenous water interactions, Northern Water Futures, Prairie Water Sensors and Sensing Integrated Modeling Program for Canada, crowdsourcing. So many of the others also have that. I've just listed a few as an example here to show you. So that's Global Water Futures, and Global Water Futures program ends in 3 years, in 2023. So we're building up this tremendous capacity for Canada, but there's a need for long-term delivery of water services and information for all Canadians. And we've identified that through co-development of programs with Indigenous communities, that can be a very fruitful way, and that these communities are ready for this information to assist in their management and to inform their management of waters as they are able to assume more and more of their rights and exercise their powers to manage water. So let's step to the Canada Water Agency. This is a proposal of the federal government, not of Global Water Futures, but is proposed from the current government. It was in the mandate letters to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and a parliamentary secretary was appointed to spearhead the agency development, and that is the Member of Parliament, Terry Duguid from Manitoba. So it's a very real thing, and there have been discussions over this summer and spring as to what that Canada Water Agency might do. So from the discussions we've had so far, a number of points have come out in there that that seem to resound at various levels. One is that the Canada Water Agency is perhaps not a regulatory agency, but it's an it's a enabling agency. It's something that has to work with provincial governments, with First Nations governments, with communities at all levels in a collaborative way, because it's not going to do everything, but we need a quarterback and to help coordinate how we address water in this country, because water flows across all our boundaries of lands and Indigenous nations and provinces, and even between the United States and Canada. So one important area was a need to bring information together and to make sure we're collecting information all the time, to create and mobilize knowledge that we need to predict and respond to water problems. This would include water quality and quantity information collected on a regular basis by multiple levels, including by citizens and community organizations and First Nations, and then bring that together in a central area, where a central clearinghouse. But with that, then, use that to help inform flood forecast, drought forecast, and water prediction models that deal with water levels, water quality, and to help inform water supply and decision support for the future. And we want to use that information to help strengthen transboundary water management, avoid disputes, anticipate disputes, improve flood mapping, work out better management practices for water. A crucial component that has resounded in discussions is we need to use this to strengthen reconciliation with Indigenous people. The Canada Water Act is 50 years old this year. It doesn't mention Indigenous people that it needs to, so we need a consent-based renewal of that act, and it's a great opportunity to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in federal water law and management. So perhaps a co-draft and co-development of that act would be a brilliant way forward. And then use all this information to improve collaborative river basin management, whether it's the Saskatchewan or the Great Lakes or the Ottawa or the Mackenzie, the other basins across Canada, to better manage that water, restore these basins, take care of the environment, and deal with our soil and water conservation issues. So a few of the things that a Canada Water Agency might do, and I think this discussion today will have tremendous importance in informing that discussion and helping to guide the design of that agency. So finally, you notice some of the artwork that's from a Global Water Future Artist in Residence, the first of more to come, Gennady Ivanov, and just saying that we need the future of water for life, and water is life, not the dystopian future that one sees over the skies of California these days. So thank you very much. I'll wrap up there, and we'll keep moving along with the program. On to Dawn.
Scano, everybody. Thank you, John and the elder who put this together for us. I think that we have a lot of work to do, and I hope this PowerPoint works. Can everybody see that? Is the PowerPoint up? Okay, great. So yes, I've been working, and I want to thank Global Water Futures for making sure that they include Indigenous voices. I think they've been really responsive, and they've acted quite quickly in assisting First Nations to be included in Global Water Futures, which is a major feat, because sometimes it could take 5 years to do what John's done in essentially 12 months. So really pleased that we're able to do some work together. It's new. Indigenous knowledge leading a team of scientists is a learning curve for all. We have 2 communities, primarily 6 Nations of the Grand River in Ontario, but also I've had a long relationship with the Lubicon Cree, who just settled a 100-year land claim. So they're quite busy setting up a new community, but obviously water is still critical to their survival and their hunting way of life. Our overarching theme is a way to harmonize Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, local expertise, with tools and technology and assessments with our team. And we do have several grants that address various things that the community has identified. This is just the co-creation team, but I think altogether we have over 40 graduate students and scientists working on one of the 3 projects. I tried to build in from an Indigenous lens, particularly Haudenosaunee, that we have a certain protocol that was developed early on. It's the Geswenta. It was made originally with the Dutch and then renewed and entered into new agreements with obviously Britain, and then to a lesser extent with Canada. The idea is quite simple. The 2 rows and wampum belts to me are essentially our codes. They're coded messages. And in them, they've defined our relationship as it is law, which is that we'll work together, we'll coexist together down the river of life peacefully, and we have our ways and our religion and our governance, and the European settlers have their ways, and that we'll work together, but try not to steer each other's boat. So we're just advising each other and helping each other. And while this is a really old agreement, it is very much a framework for governance of First Nations, Indigenous people, particularly Haudenosaunee. And one of the studies that came out that I try to cite as much as possible from the United Nations on an assessment, a global assessment over several years involving 45 scientists and over 100 nation states was, and they're not Indigenous focused, but what they did find, and one of their primary findings was anywhere that Indigenous people had been managing their own waters and ecosystems, the damage to them had been quite less severe than any other place that they had looked globally. And what that tells you is that's evidence that Indigenous ways of knowing, our methodologies, the way that we manage our environments are proven to be sound. And I think that's what science looks for, reliability and validity, if you do the same thing over and over again. The problem in Canada is that we do not manage and control our waters. In fact, we're rarely even consulted. So Global Water Futures is interested in creating those relationships, creating partnerships so that we can be more involved in what's happening to our waters. And the community designed all of these teams, and they identified the directions they needed to go, and they also identify what kinds of sensors, where the sensor would go. So it's an integrated model. We waited for the ecosystem assessment to be done so that the health team could then develop their health surveys and water security and so on. And so it's an organic process, if you will, which is an Indigenous methodology. So we have the co-creation of Indigenous water quality tools. And now we have the renewal, which is a little bit different because they wanted to do more aquatic testing of life, particularly turtles. So all of these feed the others. So then the engineers are waiting for the Indigenous knowledge methodologies to be developed with the ecosystem team, the biologists, and chemical engineering, so that they then design the sensors that would most assist the community. And they're in the phase of COVID, obviously shut down quite a bit of our operations here because the reserve closed its borders and wasn't letting anybody in that isn't a member. So we're just trying to play catch up. But the field testing sensors, we were ready to roll out one with the health team here at Six Nations, who stepped up and said they will train schools, all services to test the chlorine in waters, because that was one thing identified. But other things they've identified, Charles will address in his podcast, which I'm going to share a little bit of. And then we have OHNEGANOS, which is completely immersed in Indigenous knowledge. And it has a team that was focused on mental health. Because of climate change, water and food insecurity, we were in our initial consultations finding out that the younger population is quite distressed about the state of their environment, and rightly so. We've handed them a bad deal. We have not done well, and we have to do more. And that's essentially how the communities come together to kind of support this process, was through the youth initiatives that are built into all three of these streams. So it's quite complex. We've tried to put together charts to explain how all of these different teams interact with each other. So if we're doing, a bilingual creation for biology, for example, on an inventory, baseline inventory for what's here at Six Nations, they need to work obviously with biologists, but also elders, so that we'll have information in both Mohawk and Cayuga and also in English. So we're kind of ticking a lot of boxes that the community wanted to make sure that both knowledge systems would support and engage with one another and not be seen as completely separate, obviously, because they're interacting. Community health, it took us 2 years to develop the survey because there were so many things that we hadn't thought of that the community continued to identify. One example is the birthing center let us know that midwives, that quite a few home births are happening in homes without running water, or water that is unusable. So we didn't realize the impact, simply on the birthing center itself, which has run out of water during births, to the family and home birth. So it has such far-reaching impacts on every aspect of Indigenous people's lives that we continued to respond as best we could with what the community was identifying as priority to them. I'm happy to say COVID then came along, and obviously not having access to clean water and being told to wash your hands over and over again is easier said than done in many communities. So, it was really good. Six Nations responded really well to our research, and they agreed to pay for water for that time. Otherwise, we all have to purchase the water trucks on a weekly basis. So, you know, we're already having immediate impacts in improving community outcomes, and we're trying to detail those. So we included COVID as the community requested in our health survey. So the health team, mental health team has been working with social services. We've done a lot of outreach with the kids through social services in the schools, and they're quite happy to engage with us on this issue. And we do a lot of training with the children in the community of all ages. Beverly Jacobs at the University of Windsor is largely responsible for the framework of water governance that we will be developing with a team of clan mothers and grandmothers. And the Confederacy Council has assembled a water committee to respond to the many requests that we have of the traditional knowledge holders. So it's a lot of work, but it's also really good for the community. It's having, as I said, immediate impacts and outcomes. One of the ways that we're rethinking due to COVID, our outreach, which we had planned quite a bit in the summer, is to go live. So we started a weekly series called Let's Talk Water. It's run by the youth lead and a cultural knowledge holder who's young in the community, and they've talked to many of our stakeholders, many other First Nations communities, from the Maori to the Amazon to Six Nations, and it trends with topics. And I'm going to share some of those with you. And what we do in this is we try to disseminate our research results through this forum. And I have to say, it was really successful, and we weren't anticipating that. So one of the highest viewed shows, and we're not even really marketing it, had 2,500 views. The average views are 600, and we're still repackaging them, and we're going to run them out to do our knowledge mobilization and also recruitment, letting people know we're going to do water testing. So it's been a great tool to continue to communicate and work with the community during COVID. It's interactive. We have graduate students share their research, as well as First Nations digital stories, and also the monitoring and tap water, well water, as well as the creeks and the Grand River. So we're sharing as much as we can, but it's not an academic show. It's an Indigenous show about things that matter to them. We call it a science minute, but it's usually around 20 minutes. So this has proved to be exceptionally successful, and we're going to be operating 8 more shows, developing them to share research. So some of the work that we're able to do, and we found through storing our land, is maps that don't represent our relationship with the water. So we had the Amazon Conservation Team, who's done this all throughout the Amazon, because generally if you look at the Amazon, it doesn't tell you anything on Google Maps about the people living there and how they're harvesting or monitoring their environments. And you don't need Wi-Fi. So this is one program that we've adopted in order to continue to do research and give not just Six Nations the tools, but I had calls from Florida, I had calls from the States, South Dakota, who wanted to participate. So I'm just going to share a little bit about you, but this platform, and I don't know if it'll work because I never know if these
works.
Okay, so here it's a bit long.
That are designed by the communities, that has their knowledge and ancestral knowledge of the landscape that you have on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side, you have different stories that are associated with places in the landscape. So it's a way to both enable communities to create custom maps of their land, as in the slide that I showed earlier, where you had the gentleman that was holding up the paper map, as well as connecting the oral histories that might be connected to some of those places in the landscape. So you can either explore landscapes where we all work, and realizing that there was a lot of connections between, you know, what's going on in Six Nations and what's going on in the Amazon, and how sometimes the struggles are kind of the same and the needs are very similar. So we started to share a little bit more actively since then, and I've been lucky to be kind of involved in some of that process together with Liliana Madrigal, who is the founder of the Amazon Conservation Team. And here's a picture of all of us that we took together at the UN Permanent Forum. Akasha, I think you're in there, as well as some other folks. And we started to talk a little bit more about Six Nations, right? And how we could do a similar kind of project, really looking at the ancestral knowledge of the Haudenosaunee traditional lands. So just like in the Amazon, you know, the different Haudenosaunee communities also have their own kind of ancestral knowledge and traditional knowledge of the land. And this is a map that's kind of an example of that, where you have some place names of importance around the Grand River. How we started to work together, right, is after the United Nations, when we all met, we decided that it would be nice for Amazon Conservation Team to come up to Six Nations and to sort of share some of our experiences. And in terms of the mapping and how we've been doing this work and how we start usually working with communities and what are the different steps involved in producing maps that go into an application like Terra Stories, which has both these kinds of place name maps as well as oral histories. And so a year and some months ago, we were able to go up there, and I met with the Conegio School, and we did a couple of trainings focused on that. And we did this really exciting workshop with the students there, where the kids who are also keepers of knowledge. I mean, that's why I think your story is so beautiful, Dexter, because although we tend to think of the elders, it's younger people that also have knowledge of the lands, right? Like you two do, and everyone does. And so everybody's involved in this sharing and this transmission from generation to generation. And so for us, it was really meaningful to also sit down with the kids at Six Nations, who then also drew out their knowledge of the lands and the Grand River and what is important to them and what kind of traditional ecological knowledge they have about the river, which you would be surprised. They are aware where fish are, where there's plentiful fish, for example, because they go there with their parents to go fishing, right? So there's already that traditional knowledge that even younger people tend to have of their lands. So it's a collective process always. That's why we call it participatory mapping. And that's what ACT has always done for the past 20 years, is to work with communities, to basically to show them how to use tools so that they can do the mapping themselves.
To bring it back to Rudo, do you think that if you've caught any of his presentation, that mapping will help Six Nations?
Yeah, definitely, because when you're mapping areas and you're able to identify or even get a baseline of what the habitat looks like now, we can keep track of the changes that are occurring as the years go by, and we can identify what needs to be protected and how it's important to us, how it's significant to us, whether it's medicine or has some kind of ceremonial value to us.
So
yeah, it works.
That's just a sample of what we're doing live, and we actually did mapping live on the air between South Dakota Six Nations and it was quite interesting. So we collected data in the middle of a live show. You have to multitask. So I'm trying to get to the next slide. So I just want to show a little piece of how we're presenting the engineers and their findings to the community, because it's incredibly important. And I often tell them, please identify yourself, where you're from. They care more about you as a human being. So building relationship is something that all the scientists have been doing with Six Nations, and it's been quite wonderful process. But here's an example of the engineers and how they're presenting the data to the community.
And you can see that it flows past a bunch of large cities. Flows near to Guelph. Guelph has an estuary that combines with the Grand River. Flows by Waterloo, Kitchener, Cambridge, Brantford, and eventually, in the next click, flows past Six Nations of the Grand River. So really, Six Nations is at the tail end, at the bottom of a lot of industrialized cities. And all of these cities are dumping wastewater into the Grand River. All those green dots on that map represent wastewater treatment plants that spill their water into the Grand River. Now, that wastewater is treated, for the most part, treated up to a level that we've deemed as a Western society to be acceptable for releasing into the environment. But what they don't tell you very often is that under rainstorms, under large water events, like a heavy rainstorm or storm, a lot of raw, untreated sewage will be dumped into the river because they overflow the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant. And so for the past, this is a very, what you can see is this is a very industrialized river. It's been treated basically like a garbage dump for 100 years. Only in the 70s and 80s have we started to treat water that's flowing into the Grand River. And yet our current technologies don't treat all the wastewaters that are flowing into the Grand River. We still have these overflow contamination events.
So that's just an example, again, of the show and our research to you all as well on how we're moving forward. I also just had the last show was with Ravi talking about the sensing systems. And I have to say, honestly, the two engineers that were brought in over the 7 weeks had the most impact in terms of live questions and interest from First Nations. So they were really quite impressed with the work that we're doing here on Global Water Futures. That one didn't work. So I don't know what's happening. Oh, it's in a separate file. Sorry about that. I think I'll have to skip his and just keep going. But Ravi did an excellent job explaining the kind of water sensors and how he was waiting for the community to essentially tell him what to look for. And honestly, if we would have went in just academics without the engagement with the community, we would not have been testing for mercury in tap water. We would not have been testing for arsenic or any of the other heavy metals, because all the research was about phosphorus. So it was very interesting that they were able to respond in real time and start developing the technology and the tools based on what the elders were saying. And we had a lot of interest from First Nations about purchasing these. The funding for the sensors will be given to the schools, because I don't know if you're aware, but our immersion language schools do not have access to science textbooks in the language. So we're also developing that, and they will be the ones that put the sensors together, monitor, and we're teaching the community essentially to empower themselves so they don't need us after. I'm trying to move out of this slide and it won't let me. Okay, good. So we also have the governance piece, and we also do art contests. So this is one of the pieces of art that the kids do, but we get them to do digital stories. They're telling us what they're observing, what they're witnessing, whether it's through art and short stories. And recently, like, we're doing a TikTok to reach the younger children. And it's a way to engage First Nations to consult with all ages, which is under the Great Law, the way that we do things. We're also developing a lot of tools. So we're going to have a web platform that will house our YouTube, our digital stories, all the channels OHNEGANOS has, Facebook, Instagram, which are both training tools, teaching tools, and it can be restricted. So let's say the health data that we're going to collect, that will be restricted, or maybe there's sacred knowledge, that will be restricted, and only the community will have access to that. But the water monitoring, the real-time data, many of the things the community agrees to is going to be put out there as well. Turtle tagging is one thing they want restricted, but they're very keen to save our turtles as they're central to Haudenosaunee culture. We're also partnering with colleges to offer water certificate training where they could use Six Nations water treatment plant. Apparently we need quite a few operators. And then we're also hitting a lot of the sustainable development goals. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying, you know, it's work and everybody's a willing participant, but they're developing all these tools, and the next phase of GWF is training, building capacity so that we can govern our own waters. And currently we're working with a Grandmother's Council to develop, and with youth, what our framework for governance would be. Again, the problem is we're not sitting at the table when a lot of decisions are being made about our water. So having a water agency would be critically important to have Indigenous people at that table who are both doing science, but also offering new ways to do things. So in one of the shows, we asked Geert Deer, how would we mitigate the contaminants using traditional knowledge? And he gave us a set of things that we could do now to mitigate and absorb some of the contaminants in the Grand River. So that's the kind of interface and live real problem solving that Global Water Futures has allowed us to do. The problem is we're not at the table, and I certainly hope in the next little while. If you want to see an example of our virtual reality and this is the Knowledge Center and how we're disseminating results is through a 10-minute virtual reality, but it's also it's gonna have everything from treaties to culture, history, and then to showing them how to do water testing. So I've got to wrap it up. I don't have time to show it. I always go over. And these are many of our partners, but these aren't all of our partners. So we have a fantastic team here, and we'd really like to see an Indigenous water agency parallel, whether it's the 2-row or whether we're sitting at the table. But I think to not have us there shaping the way in which this agency evolves, it would be not the best way to improve water security for First Nations, but also water security for Canada. Nyali, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dawn.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dawn. That was simply wonderful. And I think it shows that the engagement and capabilities of Indigenous communities are at a very high level and can be high level engagement or in parallel, and that's what needs to be sorted out. But the capability is very, very impressive. What I'd like to do now is start a discussion with Michael Miltenberger. And Michael Miltenberger is a Canadian water leader, but more than that, as you'll see, he is currently the principal of North Raven, working on environmental and energy issues, governance, and collaborative consent. He has an important history. He served as a member of the Northwest Territories Legislature from 1995 to 2015, and 14 of those years he was cabinet minister, including deputy premier and minister of the environment and natural resources. He continues to lead and advise numerous co-drafting and collaborative consent approaches in the Northwest Territories in Manitoba, and lives in Fort Smith. And so I'd like to welcome Mr. Miltenberger, who has a continuing important role in improving water governance in this country, and just have a brief interview and ask him a few questions. So anyway, hello, Michael.
Good morning, John.
Yeah, good to see you. I'll step back because really go back to one of the first times I had myself much contact with you, and that was when the Northwest Territories was developing its water strategy, which many consider to be the most advanced in Canada and one of the most advanced in the world. One of the aspects of which it's considered very advanced is its inclusion of Indigenous communities and perspectives in how it's created and how it functions. And but also recognizing the interesting position hydrologically of the Northwest Territories as being downstream of other major jurisdictions such as Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and even Yukon. And so it's your waters are shared in many ways. Anyway, I wonder if you could speak to the approach used to develop that water strategy in the NWT and what's contributed to its success.
All right, very quickly, some background's important. The water strategy just didn't happen on its own. We had a tough history for a few years in the Northwest Territories till we finally realized that if we're going to do anything to resolve our relationship with Indigenous governments, we have to work with them. Specifically, there was some key legislation. The Wildlife Act was the big one that was up for redrafting, and it wasn't. It was being done the traditional way. The government held the pen, and everybody was treated as stakeholders. When we finally realized in 2005 that it wasn't going to work and it was souring our entire relationship, we agreed to a co-drafting process. I was in government at the time. I was environment minister at the time, and we went to the Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories, and we set up a co-drafting process where many hands were on the pen, Indigenous governments and public government. And we used that process. We built off of that process that helped improve our relationship by demonstrated co-governance approaches to move on to the water strategy, which was identified as the biggest priority for most Northerners. And because we had invested in our relationship and we figured out co-drafting, it was much easier to get engagement and involvement with the Indigenous governments, and we set up an Indigenous Aboriginal Steering Committee. And we spent a lot of time going up and down the Mackenzie Valley collectively to set up and develop the water strategy, Northern Voices, Northern Waters. And in fact, we even had the conservative government of the day, Minister Chuck Stroll, signed off on the water strategy, much to my surprise and pleasure, and I gave them full credit for that. And that water strategy subsequently led to the negotiations of 2 transboundary water agreements with the Northwest Territories, Alberta and British Columbia, once again in full partnership with the Indigenous governments in the North that are groundbreaking in what they achieved.
That's very important. The devolution of water from the federal government to the Northwest Territories government was occurring at the same time. Was this in parallel with the strategy development?
There was a lot of layers. It was like a layer cake, and we were trying to negotiate transboundary water agreements with Alberta. At the same time, the federal government was fighting very hard in terms of devolution to hang on to as much of the authorities that they said they wanted to devolve as possible. So it caused some very interesting lines of communication and back channel work that had to be done to work around some of those issues with Canada. But we managed to do that. We had a very, very skilled, small, nimble team of negotiators that helped us get there.
Okay, well, thank you. You've mentioned the transboundary agreements, and something that's sort of overarching around those agreements is the Mackenzie River Basin Agreement, which is considered by many to be one of Canada's better, or perhaps best examples of multi-jurisdiction cooperative water management. But nothing's perfect, and this is an agreement that the NDP has had to live with as a downstream entity. So what were some of the negotiation mechanisms that were used to come to that agreement and to sub-agreements under it, and how effective has that been in practice?
Well, the Mackenzie Basin Agreement was negotiated in a different time and different place and space where water was not nearly as critical as you've indicated today, John, where we're in a time of crisis. That it was done at a fairly leisurely pace, talking to the NWT negotiator who ended up as the Premier of the Northwest Territories for 8 years, Bob McLeod. He was at that table, and they would gather periodically with his colleagues across from the federal government and the provinces, and they would talk about this agreement, and they got some very critical principles embedded in that agreement. It finally came to fruition in 1997, but it set the stage for the transboundary agreements, the bilateral negotiations between provinces and the territories. There was also a role for Indigenous representation, very weak by today's standards, but at the time it was a starting point where each jurisdiction had an Indigenous representative as part of the Mackenzie River Basin Board. Out of that, the transboundary negotiations sprang eventually. Once we got the water strategy agreed and our thinking clear in the North, it allowed us to go to the table and pressure the other governments to come to the negotiating table to sort out these transboundary agreements in the Mackenzie Basin. And it is a good agreement, and it would be very difficult, I think, if you're going to try to have a similar discussion today, it would be much different.
Yes, I was impressed to see several years ago when there were water shortages on the Athabasca River, Alberta working with the oil sands industry to reduce water withdrawals over that period of time, and that strong evidence of a powerful agreement working well. Okay, what's a topic that's been important across the country this summer has been water quality monitoring. With the pandemic and restrictions that COVID-19 has put on many activities, including in the federal government and the science branch, the water quality monitoring has not proceeded in many areas, but it's conducted at various levels in Canada, from federal government to provincial governments, territorial communities, science organizations and universities. And so the question is back to your experience in the NWT. How is water quality being coordinated? How are you using that coordination to improve the water quality monitoring program even during a pandemic? And what can Canada learn from this?
Well, we have a very good relationship flowing out of the water strategy and the transboundary water agreements up and down the valley. One of the commitments that was made by the government of the day was to set up community-based water monitoring capacity for all the communities up and down the valley, which was done. We also worked out an arrangement with the Gordon Foundation for a process to take all the data from the testing that was done at the community-based water monitoring instruments up and down the valley in the communities and convert that data to usable information into through a data stream. It was, as it came to be called, and it exists in the north and it's been expanded and exported south. The GWT was a key player in that. So we continue to coordinate very closely with the Indigenous governments. This territorial government is in the process of setting up a Northwest Territories Council of Leaders, which will have all the territorial government and the Indigenous governments at a territorial table to work together on issues of common interest. One of those being, of course, water. With the pandemic came the realization that, in fact, Canada had stopped doing quality monitoring because they didn't consider it an essential service, and so did Alberta, and it was a huge issue of concern in the Northwest Territories. And we, of course, started a political lobby. The Indigenous governments, I know the Dene Nation and the National Chief were on the air immediately raising that issue, pushing the territorial government and the federal government. The federal government, listening to the discussions that was being held and the concerns by the Indigenous governments and the people, went to the federal government and took over their responsibilities because they were locked down because of COVID. The territorial government had figured out a way to keep doing water monitoring. And so we have that. Alberta was apparently supposed to be negotiating a similar arrangement with Canada. I'm hoping that was done because now that we've discovered, it's been proven groundwater is being polluted from the seepage out of the tar oil sands. And we have continued big spills, like the recent one at the Curl site, that it's more important now than ever.
Okay. How would you contrast that with the water quantity modeling, water quantity measurement system, the hydrometric surveys that you're aware of through the water survey?
Well, they've managed to keep business going, and I think it's just an oversight on the federal government's part that they're in the middle of a crisis. They just went with the status quo, trying to implement things that they could easily use the same approach. And I just wanted to digress just a bit because I got the mic and I'm a former politician. I just wanted to make an observation listening to the concerns already that we've heard around the table. I was at COP15 way back in the old days in Copenhagen, where they were looking for a big deal with Obama, and Canada won the Fossil of the Year award every day, or Fossil of the Day award every day that I was there. But it is the subnationals, the communities, provinces, territories, First Nation governments that lead. National governments don't lead on these issues. They finally hear what the people are saying and will start to respond. And everything we've seen here today as well confirms that point. This Canada Water Agency didn't spring fully formed from the mind of some very clever individual in the federal government. It was the result of 3 years of hard work with the Forum for Leadership of Water, Global Water Futures, the Center for Indigenous Environmental Research, POLIS, Indigenous governments across the land, NGOs, pushing and creating this issue, and aided by the increasing crisis that you so well documented, where we have no choice to do what we're doing. And the federal government, to their credit, has finally responded.
Well, thank you. And that's fantastic words from Mr. Miltenberger, showing that leadership, in this case, has come from the Northwest Territories on water and some great lessons learned that could be applied federally on that, on how to better coordinate and to truly liaise and work with Indigenous communities to implement a water strategy. So we'll move on. And we'll turn it back to Stephanie to introduce our panel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, so we're going to build on Michael's experiences with a couple more panel guests. So I'll just introduce them really quickly. Dr. Deborah McGregor, she's going to facilitate the next section of the agenda. She's an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at York University's Osgoode Hall Law Faculty. Dr. McGregor is Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island, Ontario. Mr. Gary Carrier is Cree Nation, trapper, fisherman, hunting outfitter, and president to local fisheries, but he describes himself mostly as a passionate advocate for the health of the Saskatchewan River Delta. Professor Amy Kraft is associate professor at the Faculty of Common Law at the University of Ottawa, and she's a highly recognized Anishinaabe Métis lawyer from Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. So I'll turn it over to Deb to facilitate a discussion amongst the panel.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I can see there's lots of participants and lots of comments, so glad to see that people are engaged so far. Really want to thank Elder Roland Duchette for his opening and reminding us about what's important and being able to take us from the local to the global as he's talking about some of the initiatives, innovative initiatives going on in other jurisdictions around the country. So we're already running a little bit behind, so we'll see how we get through the panel questions, and then hopefully still have time for questions that are coming from participants in the session, which we know that there's a few of them. So I did want to say that I thought John did a great job of outlining the water crisis that Canada faces, but also wanted to acknowledge that had been something that Indigenous peoples had been saying for quite some time, and has been a lived experience for a very long time in terms of wanting to see action for decades, actually, in Canada. So I wanted to start off by just asking Professor Kraft a question. So you've had a chance to hear from Dawn in her amazing presentation and the work that she's doing, engaging from youth to elders in the work that she's doing. You've had a chance to listen to Michael at a different scale in terms of advancing water protection in the Yukon and Northwest Territories in the North. So with Amaya, I wanted to, based on her experience, if her profile is like long and she's doing amazing work with decolonizing water and some of her own initiatives. So Amaya, just wanted you to just reflect and perhaps describe what the Indigenous legal governance sort of landscape looks like. What is it that this agency needs to know and understand about, instead of just how Indigenous peoples should be fitting into the agency, what is it that they need to know in order to make informed decisions about what Indigenous co-development or engagement or collaboration looks like?
Thanks for the question, Deb. It's a big question, and I think it varies amongst the nations, the different Indigenous groups in Canada. And I think the first part of my answer would be that there are a lot of nations that are affirming jurisdiction with respect to water through the exercise of sort of inherent legal orders, but also through the development of legislated codified efforts to create water law. So I think that's an important development in terms of how things have changed in Canada since sort of the last foray into the federal water policy and the Canada Water Act in the 70s and 80s, right? So this is a new part of the legal landscape. It's part of the governance and policy and political landscape that we need to be keenly attuned to. And I think what distinguishes that from sort of this broad idea of we need to get collaborative governance working, and that cooperative federalism has an answer to that. I think we need to look at cooperative federalism plus and think about Indigenous jurisdictions and authorities, and to expect and respect that they're going to look a little bit different. So they're going to look different in terms of not just the jurisdictional questions in terms of the subject matter or the who is responsible and has authority for governance, but also the where. So questions about watershed-based management and work within traditional territories or treaty territories, I think are going to be some key concerns that will be raised by First Nations in anything relating to a future water agency and development of policy and the activities that would take place under the scope of an agency. So thinking about those multiple jurisdictional questions, right? The who, the where, the what, and how from an Indigenous perspective, those are going to be framed differently, and how Indigenous governments are really acting already in terms of legislating relating to water governance. And I think that thinking more broadly about how we approach water governance and how water management has sort of been the place where there's been involvement of Indigenous people over the last 30 years, and we're moving beyond management into sort of high-level governance and systems of values that need to be taken into account that reflect Indigenous legal orders. And all of that, I think, it really needs to reflect the international landscape, which is moving to processes for decision-making, institutions of decision-making that are Indigenous. So I would want to see, for example, a Canada Water Agency that has this acknowledgement of Indigenous jurisdiction and a co-created model that is centered on collaborative governance, but looks at that governance as including Indigenous jurisdictions as well. And I think that that's reflected in a response and an inclusion of the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into any of the development and creation and visioning for an agency.
A follow-up thought that I had, May, relates to, based on the work that you've done and just how water is kind of conceptualized within the Canadian Water Agency and the white paper, and maybe even how we're talking about it in this conversation, is how do you think we kind of need to think about water maybe a little bit differently? Like when I think about the work that you did on the WB Declaration, like do we need to expand our horizons a little bit here? And Indigenous people are going to talk about this in different ways, and people kind of need to be ready for what Indigenous people are going to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's been interesting is the response that I've had to some of the work where I speak to, and through the elders' knowledge and Indigenous legal orders, capturing this understanding that water governs itself, so it has agency. And in the opening prayer, Elder Duquette, you were speaking to personhood, and that's one sort of Western framing in law of what I think Indigenous people have said for a very long time. And so, that concept that water has this authority and governance that's inherent to itself, and that we may actually need to be responsive to it. And a lot of us have seen examples of that. We may not see it as a jurisdictional question or agency of water sort of at the front of our minds. And I think the prime example is flooding. But water is governing itself, right? And there's some external influences and factors that are part of that. But thinking about, water as having this inherent agency and authority and having roles in response to that. So one of the things that supports sort of a different framing is actually understanding how Indigenous laws are very different from Western legal orders. So right now we're probably in this Western realm, and in the white paper you were referring to, thinking about water as a resource that's to be owned and managed and controlled. If we flip that and look at, for example, an Anishinaabe perspective, we're going to think about, what's our relationship with water? What's our relationship with all of those other beings that are in interaction with water? And then we start to see this very complex web of relationships that are jurisdictional in nature. So they are about who has a responsibility towards who. and a lot less focused on the ultimate rights that are being exercised by the parties. So I think that in itself is plunking a very different framework into decision-making from sort of the Western anticipated framework. Also motivated by very different foundations. So for example, you know, when we're thinking about management, control, access, possession of water, we're thinking about it mostly from the perspective of protection of private property interests or common property interests. Whereas from an Indigenous perspective, we need a different focus that is on that sort of relational element that I was referring to a little bit earlier in my comments. So I think the frameworks pieces and understanding sort of what is law, what are the motivations behind different systems of law, and trying to figure out how in that kind of plural environment, we can create an agency that can rest on those foundations and adequately collaborate and allow for Indigenous decision-making, institutions of Indigenous decision-making and processes and methodologies like some of those that Don was referring to that kind of take governance in a different direction.
Thank you, Amay. I'm just going to turn to Gary. Gary, I hope you're still on. I know that you're participating by phone, but as someone who's a trapper and a fisher, so you're on the water, you're on the land all the time. But you're also involved in different research projects with Global Water Futures. How do you see like some of the comments that Professor Kraft has made and in your experience and the research that you're involved in? Like, how do you see like your knowledge, like on the land knowledge, land-based knowledge, water-based knowledge, playing a role in the creation of this agency? Do you see a role for that, one that can work?
Definitely. We have a place in this I guess pandemic, I'll say. We are the people that see firsthand, what's happening with the environment within our own regions, and of course, we've been myself, I've been educated by my elders all these years, and they always told us that the wildlife will be your indicators, and they're the ones that are going to tell you if the environment is in jeopardy. And that's of course living in the land year round, and you see firsthand what's happening with the environment and with the animals. When the numbers have dwindled definitely in this area easily by 50% already, and the numbers are so critical, I guess. Definitely they're screaming out to us and telling us that something has to be done here because we're not going to survive in this environment that we have already. And definitely that's how the First Nations and the trappers and people that still live off the land can be a tool in this in what we're working with. Just a little story. I was just thinking about this 45 years ago. My grandfather, Nipwin, it's only 2 hours away, but back in those days, we rarely left the community because there was no need to leave because we had everything here. And then we walked into a store, and then they see him and his friend, another elder there, seen wood in a store, and they were so amazed, how they seen people selling wood in a store. And then my grandfather said, "My friend, mark my word," he says, "there's a time coming that people will be buying water from the store." Somehow he foreseen that the water would be contaminated, that it wouldn't, I don't know how he knew that, but somehow he knew that. And I believe Indigenous people have that gift from God to detect through what they observe with the environment that things are not where they should be, and then that's how I guess we could be a tool in this team, and to be observers in the land, and to inform what we know to our partners, like the scientists, like, and to help us to advocate not to destroy our environment. And that's one thing too I've always had in my mind, is like the one thing that I've heard through as a kid, like all these years, that there's three things that we can't survive without. I know water is one of them, land is another thing, and air. There's three things that are very, very important that we need to focus on. Like, I know we're in the topic of water, but there's two other things that we need to focus on. So those three things that we need to survive. Yeah.
I like, Gary, how you really sort of bring forward a really holistic perspective. Like we're having this conversation about water and a conversation about a national water agency, but you're talking about these other aspects that we need to also consider. I also really appreciate how you talk about, like in science, we would call them indicators, of what the land might be telling us, what the wildlife, what the fish might be telling us. But the way that you describe it, you talk about them almost like they're teachers telling us something, like they're trying to teach us something about what's happening on the land. So I really appreciate that about your comments, and we have good questions coming in, so hopefully there'll be time for you to be able to respond to them. But I think your comments and just my short remarks might lead into a question I have for Dr. Martin Hill, and particularly she had a fantastic presentation, but obviously didn't have time to say everything she would like to say, is how do you see the role of traditional knowledge? A lot of the projects that you have focus on that, and gender kind of playing out at the scale of a national water agency. So you have a number of projects. You're looking at monitoring, developing tools, but at the same time talking about governance. How do you see that being scaled up to a national water agency, and the kind of things that they need to think about, maybe some of the challenges that they're going to face that they need to really do some work on in order to work with what Gary just shared with us?
I think what I would do is, like at Six Nations, we have a elected council that I work with, Public Works, Health Services. They're critically important for providing, the quality of life, great advocates. And then we have a traditional government that has existed from time immemorial, like well over 1,000 years, with a constitution that has 117 laws. Women, children all have rights, but more importantly, as Amy pointed out, our laws are about, we're not the center of the universe as human beings. It's about our responsibilities to our environments and relationships. So if I just look at it, which is complex from a Haudenosaunee Mohawk woman's lens, then we're looking at a few things. One is that we're like, the personhood model is one model. It's a tool. It's not, our elders would say, no, the water's far more important than human beings because it hosts much life. So we would be looking at protections. Secondly, because we have colonial impacts in all communities, whether you're with AFN or Chiefs of Ontario or traditional governments, women, though, are not well represented in those institutions. And women are water, and I've yet to hear any Indigenous person on the planet say that water is the domain of the male. It's the domain of the female, period. We don't need to explain that. It just is, and it's entrenched in our laws. And yet they've been not at the table, even when Indigenous leaders are at the table. So that colonial patriarchal model has been one of the biggest barriers. Who deeply cares about the water, if you are involved in any actionable items, are women, grandmothers particularly, in communities. So if I was looking at building a model, one important factor is that rather than going by political alliances, which I think would stop everything, because everybody, you know how that would go. We're not there yet in terms of self-government, but women who have been researching, they're experts, advocating, there's, you know, stakeholders should be at the table rather than politicians. Simply because those people may not be there 3 years from now. You want longevity, and I don't think any of the leadership would challenge that it should be women at the table if there is a water agency, whether that table is a completely indigenous, like a 2-role model framework where we are regionally, you know, where our territories are from. And we would work to develop, I have a grandmother's council, but I also work with band council, and I also work with the Confederacy. But the work that gets done in the community is by the women, right? So I think that kind of reshifting focus away from these political institutions, which may not be the best way to go, look at who are experts and who's doing research or governance in these areas should be at the table at least, and how that process plays out. So that would be fundamentally important. And that, you know, looking at laws, if you look at what happened in Bolivia with President Morales, who's indigenous, who really was before the Maori in getting protections for their forest. It was undone basically by Elon Musk in order to have clean energy. They went in there and unseated that president and put in somebody who would undo all the protections. So law is important, but I think if we focus more on the moral, like John was saying, we're in trouble. Like, period. We're just in trouble. Like, climate change, water security isn't going to just be a First Nations problem. It's going to be a human problem, especially 2050. If you read all the reports, we're all in trouble. Why not? Like, the way I put it is, we can't possibly do a worse job than already been done. So Indigenous people should be at the forefront, not an addition. And we need the support of scientists and governments to work with us to maybe try to salvage some of the wanton development that's happening all around us. Now at Six Nations, you know, the youth took on Nestle because they're taking our aquifer. When Six Nations, 90% of the people don't have access to clean water, but we're one of the highest economic grossing, employed, educated communities living next to cities. And if you step across the road to our reserve, you don't have access to clean water. So there's environmental racism, there's systematic racism. And if you want to have a water agency that responds to the history of colonialism, you're going to have to rethink how business has been done. And it's not going to be one size fits all. Like, that's meetings that should happen between, to me, Indigenous people who are dedicated to this issue of water research or water protections or advocacy, and having youth at the table to build capacity is essential. Having grandmothers and elders advise us. I think that if I could dream up a model, it might look something like that.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm going to direct this question to Michael. So I was interested in a number of things that you talked about, and I guess the thing that was sort of kind of making my head explode, having worked in Environment Canada for 10 years and a number of political agencies, but also even just what Professor Kraft talked about, what Gary talked about, and what Professor Martin Hill just said, is like, in terms of who is advising for the development of the legislation that you talked about, but also how to scale it up to the national level. What stuck in my mind is, well, it would be kind of easy to do, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, how do you how do you envision that? Were youth on advising? Were women part of advising? Were they generally politicians, or how do you see that kind of? What are some kind of lessons learned that would be helpful for the Canada Water Agency? Because nothing ever goes perfectly. So what are some of those like bumps that we need to sort of work through? And when I listen to Professor Kraft, Gary, and Professor Martin Hill, like we're like in many ways talking about a different worldview, and we're trying to, the Canada Water Agency has this challenge of trying to, understand and figure out how to work with a different worldview and the work that they want to do. How do you see some of the, like you would have confronted some of this, I'm sure heard similar stories in the work that you did. So be glad to hear about how you're kind of processing what you're hearing.
Thank you. I'll just offer half a dozen points that'll hopefully capture some of the questions that you've posed, and recognizing that we're in a state of crisis, as been pointed out by John. In the work that I do, in the position I take, and the people I work with, we see Canada as having 3 founding nations. And this is part of real reconciliation, where there needs to be a seat at the table of confederation finally created for Indigenous peoples and governments, that I've come to, in my view, see the way to water and dealing with water is through governance, and how you set up the conditions and the structures to, in fact, allow all this good work to be done. It's been clearly pointed out again that the status quo is not working. It's clear that no one level or government can do this alone. And you have, if you want to create a Canada Water Agency, you have to have the governments and the levels of government, Indigenous, Canada, provinces, territories, municipalities, come to the table and not fight over your jurisdiction, but just recognize that you have jurisdiction, and you're bringing your jurisdiction to the table, and you're going to, with the political will that you also bring, you're going to figure out how to put those jurisdictions to work for the good of all the people and for the survival of the country. And if you have political will, then there's nothing that's not possible. Even at the national level, there's entrenched bureaucracies, there's entrenched institutions, but they're going to change because they have no choice, and the will and the push from the people, from the kitchen tables of the country, First Nations and everywhere else on up, is going to be unstoppable. And it's clear as you look at all the good work that's being done that that's the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think what we'll do now, because we basically got 20 minutes left in the session, I want to thank everybody. There's the other questions if you wanted to address them, but then there's this like huge one in the chat that seemed to be sort of emerged after Professor Kraft's comments. And I'll just, I don't know if you've seen it, Tamaine, it's from Christine Mettler. And it's to all panelists. So it's huge. It's a huge question, so people can, pick the part that kind of works, speaks to their experience, I think, the best. And the question is, I think that's an incredible and important way to conceptualize water, but I have such a hard time imagining how it could be operationalized when the Canada Water Agency would be at worst a colonial institution where the private property system is the foundational law and worldview, and at best by a cultural institution co-governed with Indigenous peoples. Do you have any examples of how a relational, non-resource-based view of water has been operationalized in an institution? Also, thinking about this in the context of the Canadian Water Agency will almost necessarily be a top-down institution. So, that's really huge. Like, whoever can answer that should win the Nobel Prize, really, and so, or something really important. So I'll start off with Amay, because I know you also have to leave right at 3, so I wanted to make sure that you have a chance to tackle this.
Thanks. It is a big question, and I'm grateful for the question, because I think there are examples we can look to, and I think there's been a lot of attention in the last few years around the Wanganui River and personhood, and I think that's probably the most recent and prime example of how you can have an Indigenous structure that is acknowledged through the New Zealand legislation, and then have a trust board that is responsible to the river. And they actually adopt very much that view that I was speaking to, where they're acknowledging the agency and inherent authority of the river itself, right? And acting as trustees for that, that purpose. And then within that structure, you do have seats that are both government designated and Maori. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not sure that it works perfectly. And it may, it may solicit different answers to the question about how well it works. But I think it's one where there's at least an acceptance of the different sets of values that inform how co-governance is supposed to be taking place with respect to the Wanganui River. So I would say that's one example. And I think that there are also spaces, and I think this needs to be acknowledged in any discussion about, co-governance and co-jurisdiction, is that you can have, and what I would envision for a Canada Water Agency is that it would have different components. So rather than to think of sort of one monolith agency, that it would have the potential to look at things differently and create substructures that are reflective and that have that are potentially equally authoritative, but that can feed into decision making in a different way based on different sets of values. So rather than trying to sort of indoctrinate or change either perspective, that they can sit and coexist side by side, and that those values can inform sort of the different perspectives. And I like John's suggestion about, the grandmothers sitting together. And I think of a recent governance exercise where the Women's Council of Treaty 3 worked together and worked within the nation and consulted with, or engaged the entire nation in the development of a Nibe Declaration. And they did that within 18 months, and they had an approval at the nation, at the national level. Not one person that was engaged in that process, and there were many, was opposed to the values that were being articulated. And there was a cohesion and sort of an authoritative approach by the women who were acknowledging their responsibility as jurisdiction in bringing that forward on behalf of the nation. So I think there are keen, willing participants in sort of that different way of exercising decision-making authority. And I think decision-making authority might be too strong a term, rather, influencing how the relationships with water can develop over time, and sort of some of the aspirational sort of policy pieces about what we want a water future to look like within this broader territory and throughout Turtle Island.
Thank you, Amy. I think, Dawn, I'm just also building upon that question, which was for all panelists to consider. Like in just the example that Amy talked about in New Zealand, I remember one of the last times I was there, and the people who were involved in the co-governance model said to me, they still struggle with Indigenous knowledge coming to the table. The scientists would say, could you show me the textbook? Like, where's the graphs? And they're like, that's not how it works. So like, how would you see, like, how do you, like, this is what you're doing, like every day you're thinking about this in the project that you have. Like, how do you see that? How could you see that possibly being addressed in this example?
It's not easy, I'll say that much. It's a learning curve for, I think, the stakeholders, both the scientists, the services community. But what I find is when I gather, like I had a meeting with one of Dr. Karen Kidd for the new project, because the elders had identified turtles as the metric to look at how well we're doing, how well the water's doing. And I think sitting them in that room and just having those conversations with a question posed, and I see myself more as a facilitator of that discussion. I'm bringing very different ways of knowing. But I find, and I think John, being at Six Nations and talking to some of our traditional knowledge holders, even local experts, like so much of what we learned was from the guys running our water treatment plant and have been doing that for 30 years. They do this every day, all day long. There's no scientist that's going to walk in and tell them anything they likely don't know. In fact, they told the engineers basically to look for heavy metals as well. So it's not just traditional knowledge, it's local knowledge, expertise, frontline workers, I guess you call. And I find when you try to bring these people together, and the central issue is we need to secure water for the future of our children. Climate change is at our door. You get rid of all the egos, I'll say, put it mildly. And I find these really amazing conversations happen. And then the biologist is in total agreement that the turtle is the best metric. And yes, looking at what she knows from her background. So it can happen. The key is getting the right people to the table. And I think many times you'll have somebody sent to a meeting just because nobody else wants to go. So mobilizing your community is number one, mobilizing around this issue of water. Who shows up time and time again is the person that should be listened to, versus, well, I'm going to send this person to that water environmental meeting, and it's just a job to them. They're going to be gone in 2 years to another job. So I think essential is finding the right scientists. And I've approached, I'll be honest, when we started out, we had about 40 scientists sitting around the table for co-creation. Once I became the lead, and IK was leading, and we talked about ownership of data, half the team left because they couldn't cope with the idea that they couldn't control all the data that they were going to be creating. But that's what co-creation is. So I think vetting people that you're working with is critically important so that you don't run into those issues at the end of that. And the same vetting in your own community, who's working on these. So I think, again, if you're going to do a water agency, we can't just send representatives. You have to find the right people who have been dedicated to this issue, and how you translate. So for example, with the turtle, the other one they wanted to test was amniotic fluid in women. So they approached the birthing center because that study that Gudgy Cook had done in the 80s really opened the scientific world's eyes. The fact that he knew that women had higher PCBs in their fluid, amniotic fluid, and the breast milk than Mohawk women who are living right next to 3 factories. So, when they listened to us from the beginning in the design, that's when things work well. And that's when ownership and passion and dedication come out, because these people will continue. But I think what happens is in these institutional colonial models, they just send representatives or political people who may not be there 4 years from now. So you're going to have a completely different viewpoint from another leader on this issue. So it's important, I think, who's at the table. And I agree with you, Amy, if the grandmothers are the equalizing force in every Indigenous community I've ever visited, and I've visited many. There's no arguing that's going on, no big conflict. Like, they get the work done. They do the task because women are practical. We're worried about getting clean water to feed our children, because I've gone without water living at Six Nations. When you run out of water, your whole life is interrupted. So we understand the day-to-day grind. And I think, our male counterparts are just as important to kind of navigate the political bureaucracies and legalities, but the direction and the force of this should come from a grandmother's council that represents various Indigenous people in Canada, and they would develop and design how they think this should go. So as much as I can say this is how I think it should go, I kind of know already that I'm already stepping ahead of myself, because we haven't had a meeting to ask them. Although the grandmothers have come up with all the priorities that Six Nations is doing. So again, Nestle, they were very upset about the groundwater being taken by Nestle. The young people got the cease and desist, and it was helped. We were helped by the Maori who were visiting us to design that cease and desist, and Nestle has packed up and left. Another company was going to buy it, but the kids put up a billboard saying, please don't take our water. You know, it doesn't have to always be conflict and difficult. I think we all agree water in the ground should stay only as drinking water. It should never be used for commercial reasons. So I think if we came up with a principles document about what are the priorities, that would then tell you who needs to be at the table. And there's no problem translating traditional knowledge into science. I mean, our project is proving that. It just takes effort and energy to get them in that room to say, how would we best protect our water? That could be the key question. And I guarantee you they'll come up with all the measures that we need to do to improve water quality, improve the water quantity, and make sure that the public is informed. Transparency is critical to ensuring any success of any endeavor. Those would be my recommendations. But there's not a lot of people doing this, and the time it takes, I'll acknowledge, it's extensive.
Thank you. I think I'll just leave the last word for Gary. Gary, so just in terms of what you listened to in this huge question, which took up all the question and answer period, because now it's 10:02, and we still have to get our closing. Like what are the kind of things that you think, like in your experience, like being a fisher and trapper, being on the land and waters and working on projects, what are some of the things that you think scientists need to know in terms of being able to work with you and others that you know about, people who maybe think in the language and speak the language? Like what are the kind of qualities that you think are needed there to really be able to listen in order to make co-governance happen the way that Ame and Dr. Martin Hill have talked about?
Okay, I'm just saying it's a very, very tough question to answer, but I know that we're on the right path is what I'll say about this area, because not very long ago, nobody was concerned about what was happening with water, but now today there's a few people that stuck out their necks and start talking about the water, but I don't know the right recipe, how we approach this. Like I don't know, but I know that we are in the right path with how we're engaging with scientists. Definitely, we need science on board, and of course, like they're the guys that are going to convince the governments what's happening with the water in our country, and I know it's a tough work ahead of them, and but of course, definitely, I know one of the panelists said that we all need each other. I know some of us don't have the education you guys have, but we have the education of the land and education with animals and all that. And I know, like we need a variety of people in the panel to move forward in this important issue. And I just don't really have any answers right now, but I just thankful that we are in discussion of the situation that we're faced with, and hopefully that in the near future that through the help of God, and that you will give us the wisdom that we need to how to move forward with this important issue. And of course, a thought that I was thinking about just a while ago. Whenever we impact animals, either domestic or wild animals, there's always a price to pay. And I know in the planet here that every creature that's in this planet is very important, and we need to like be more careful into the future how we impact the wildlife in Canada and everywhere else in the world, I guess, because this COVID that we're faced with, it's just, I hope it's a eye opener, and I know when you look into history that every COVID that we ever had was involving impacting some kind of animal in the planet. So and I know with how we're contaminating with the water today, we're impacting a lot of wildlife, and I know we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I don't know the answers, but if we keep brainstorming about this issue, I'm sure eventually we will come up with some solutions. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Gary. I'll just spend a minute just summarizing a little bit of what I heard. I mean, it's not going to do any justice to represent the knowledge in any way of this panel, but I think I'll just start with what Gary shared, which is that there has to be ongoing dialogue. It's just, there isn't a one-shot, one-fit kind of scenario that's going to happen. So I agree. We've heard ideas around Indigenous laws and ideas of responsibilities beyond rights and how that should be considered appropriately, what co-governance actually looks like, what common knowledge is going to support that, how this could be scaled, how we learn from other examples that Michael talked about, making sure the right people are at the table who are really invested long-term in these kind of discussions and in wanting to have an outcome to protect waters, but also have an appropriate relationship with waters. Fundamentally, we're dealing with different worldviews. This isn't the first time, and how can we then learn from these other experiences that would happen, even most recently in some of the environmental reform in terms of establishment of Indigenous advisory committees and how traditional knowledge is recognized. So there's a lot to learn from that we could, that the creation of a Canada Water Agency has a lot to build on. We don't need to make the same kind of mistakes that have been made before and actually build upon and grow from that. So I'm going to stop there. I want to thank the panelists so much for their words and remarks, and I'll turn it over to John, and we'll have our closing, and I think we might actually kind of be on time. So miigwech again to all the participants as well and the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you so much for the panelists. The discussion that you just had, the information you shared is a great gift for Canada and for those who are developing the Canada Water Agency. I think that when you get a gift like that, you treat it and cherish it and treat it properly. And with this sort of information, we can create a Canada Water Agency that can contribute to decolonizing water management across this country, and it ties into so many other things. Of course, we not only have the water crisis, we have equity crisis, we have crisis as our different peoples in North America try to get along and treat each other better and more fairly. We also have a massive crisis with wildlife and the natural ecosystems, as the World Wildlife Report yesterday outlined. The news is terrible for the natural environment. These are all tied together, and so it's solving some aspects of this that we can, perhaps with Water in Canada, can improve so many other aspects as well. We can do great good in this country and be a model for the rest of the world in how to do that. So Stephanie, I was wondering if you could share the slide showing how to participate in the Environment Canada Water Portal feedback and discussion for their Place Speak forum. And that's a way you can directly communicate with the federal government as part of their consultation on the Canada Water Agency, and that's a great way to get comments in. We're also going to compile everything from this meeting and send it to them as well, but you can participate directly. So this is crucial things. The discussions are ongoing on the Water Agency. It's not created yet, and we're hopeful because of the urgent need that it will start to take concrete form very, very soon. Time is out, and to do something. And I think that's come through loud and clear at this meeting. There are further webinars coming up, and so we many partners in trying to organize events that can better inform the water agency. And the next one is on September 17th. And this is hosted by IISD and the Gordon Foundation and Aqua Forum. And so that will involve Carolyn Dubois, Scott Higgins, Melissa Dick, and Jamie Smith on how Canada can use innovation to protect its fresh water. And there are further seminars coming up. On October 13th, 2 parts, the role Quebec should play within the Canada Water Agency, and the awareness of Canadians about water issues from the Bobian Foundation. So more to come on this. And but otherwise, Global Water Futures, we carry on. We're proud that we've had Indigenous communities across the country willing to work with us, and we want to carry on with that. And I'm so happy to see what has developed from that research and the benefits it can provide to Canada and to those communities. So thank you so much for tuning in.
So I'll ask Elder Duquette to come back and give us a final closing.
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments and input. It's always one of the most sacred things that we can have a discussion on is the water. Like for example, in inception, when there's a seed to be planted, the first drop is the water that wakes it up. So let's work with that and see what we can wake up, agencies, governments, support groups, to find that drop of water to wake up the seed that's going to be spreading, to full grown. That's my thought, my gift to all of you to think about and work with that. It's not nothing is impossible, as we say. Everything is possible. Alternatives are there, and just understanding how people perceive that as we don't own it, but it's sourcing us to be alive, sourcing other communities where it flows. And I think that's the importance of that, is not claiming it as your own to pocket into a dam or something, that when you divert water from a community, you're there's damage to be done into that community. So to work at thinking about it in a global sense, then we have something to work with, because when you think in that spiritual laws, the natural law system that we have and the matriarch system that we have, I think we can work with that, because we have to be gentle to Mother Earth and not to harm it anymore. So I'm just going to do a closing prayer that your travels will be safe wherever you are, and your homes will be looked after by Creator in a safe way, and your children were going to be looked after by Creator. That we cannot fear the pandemic, but we don't have to claim it. I think that's some of the things that we need to do as well. So that's my message. It's my prayer to all of you. And it's always an honor. I'm humbled by that to do the closing prayer. Ano tawinan ksimanto kag sewa tinanas komuyan igisita mo chiko mamsku chikiwak yogamina no tawinan inanas komuyan igimi no maapon kagagi sumuyan kagagi smustatan kichinachkia kami tanan ma nanas komun yogamina ka kiotakan tutakik kami opmatso kami omatsuhog kanahemwak kage wega kusta kek maga mote chik. Yagame mi tanki chik in an askumuyan. Magak simanto manto gusan gapat sawak the we hold. In Jesus' name, amen. And also, just to reference the group, always work side by side. Don't walk ahead of your leader, walk with the leader. That's my message again in closing. Hi, hi.
Thank you, Elder Duquette, for closing so eloquently. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a good rest of the day.